In this movie, we're going to take a very brief look at the bitwise operators. I should start this movie by saying that it's very unlikely that you're going to need to use bitwise operators in your SQL. Bitwise operators are used for very specialized purposes, and you're more likely to encounter them in programming than in SQL. Let's take a look at what they do nonetheless though. Essentially, a bitwise operator works in a similar way to the logical operators we've just seen. The bitwise operators are represented, this is the OR and this is bitwise AND. You'll notice that we just use 1. With a logical operator we use 2 to represent a logical OR, and we use 2 to represent logical AND. With a bitwise OR, for instance, what this expression is asking MySQL to do is to look at each of the bits or binary digits of the two numbers either side of the bitwise operator as separate, and to carry out an OR operation on each of the bits. If you're familiar with binary, you'll know that when a computer looks at the number 3, it's really looking at the number 3 in binary terms, but it chooses to use a decimal system because that's the one we're more used to when it shows us the number. So to a computer, the number 3 is really represented as 1, 1, and the number 1 is the same as 1. So with this particular binary operation, first of all it tries to compare the lowest 1, that is the 1 of 1, and the rightmost 1 in the binary representation of 3, which is 1, 1, and it will find, if it finds either of those to be true, that is 1, then it will return 1 to the result. So in this case, essentially we're looking at 1 and 1 and 1, 0 and 0, 0 being compared using an OR operation. So the result that is spat out by MySQL is a 3. Effectively 1, 1 has been compared to 1, or we could look at it as 0, 1, and because there was a 1 in both of those places, whether in one or the other of the two numbers that we're comparing, both of those binary places are filled and we get the response 3. If we use the binary AND operator instead, then it would require both places, that is the places in both numbers, to be filled for each bit in order to return a true or a 1. So in this case it would return a 1. If we tried to compare 1 and 2, remembering that 1 represented in binary would be just a single digit 1, and 2 would be 2 digits, 1 and 0, we can see that neither of those two would fill exactly the same space. So although there is a 1 in 1 and the second place is filled in 2, they don't correspond in either, so we get 0 as a result. If however we tried comparing the decimal numbers 1 and 2 with a binary OR operator, then because both places have been filled either in one or the other of the two numbers, we get 3 as a response, which is in binary 1, 1. If all of this is not making very much sense to you, then don't worry about it at all. You probably won't have to use this kind of thing in MySQL. If you've encountered binary operators before, then suffice it to say that although simpler, than the ones on offer in some other more complex programming languages. They work in a very similar way. There is another binary operator we should be aware of if we're going to work with them at all, which, as I've said before, is not necessary to effective database management, but could be interesting, so I'm including these for the sake of completeness, is the bitwise shift operators. This is the leftward bitwise shift, and what this does, this is a simpler concept actually, is it shifts the number that we feed to the bitwise shift operator either left a space or right a space, or however many spaces we specify after the bitwise shift. So in this case we're asking MySQL to shift the number 1 up a single space. Now if this was a decimal shift, then we would be shifting 1 to 10, but because we're using binary, we're simply shifting 1 up a binary space, so that's 2. If we were to shift it 2 spaces up, we'd get 4. If we were to shift it 3 spaces up, we'd get 8. If we were to shift the number 1 up 4 spaces, we'd get 16. There's also the rightward shift operator, which does pretty much what you may imagine having looked at the leftward shift operator. If we move 16 down, let's say we move it 1 space, we get 8. If we move it down 4 spaces, it'll return our figure to 1. If we try to shift it down too many spaces, then the numbers will drop off the end and we'll get nothing at all. Once again, if this movie has blinded you with science, don't fear, you're very likely not ever to need these operators in your database management systems. I'm including this movie for the sake of completeness and to show the totality of the operators available to you within MySQL.